Welcome to Gulfstream Legal's Poolside Chats. Today, we are going to be talking about how to revolutionize your workflow, a deep dive into relativity active learning, unleashing the power of AI for enhanced legal review. So today, I have the privilege. I am joined by Taylor Wise from our project management team. Taylor, say hi to everybody.
Hi, it's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh no, that is perfect. So we're going to get right into this subject. Before we do that, um, the best person to kind of introduce Taylor, even better than I can, other than saying that she's one of my favorite project managers to work with on our team, I'm going to let Taylor talk a little bit about herself. Tell everybody a little bit about your kind of unique background and your journey coming to Gulfstream Legal.
Sure. I think that one of the unique things about my particular background is I used to be on the other side. I worked in law firms and I also did government work. I worked for the U.S. Attorney's Office as a legal assistant, and I worked as a paralegal. So I was on the other side of eDiscovery and that whole process. I have a different perspective when it comes to the project management team of what it feels like to be in y'all's shoes and the speed of litigation and all of those fun things.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I know that we are more than happy, and our clients are more than happy to have you as part of the part of the team. But we're going to kind of deep dive directly into here and talk about taking your e-discovery workflow to the next level. So let's start with kind of an overview and a deep dive details into active learning. Now, for anybody who was with me on my last webinar, this might be a little bit of a refresher, but anybody who wasn't, I think Taylor's perspective on exact and her explanation, let me say, of exactly what active learning is in relativity environment is one that you can't miss. So Taylor, why don't you kind of, sum up active learning and let everybody know exactly what we're going to be discussing today.
Sure. So, active learning, and I know that you did a great job on that webinar before. I was actually in the room watching, and it was a great explanation. It takes the extracted text of a set of data and uses that information to identify trends as reviewers are going through documents and coding documents based on a yes no response field, whether that be responsive, non responsive, or however, whatever terminology you want to use in that yes no field. Um, and there's two types to this active learning model that can be built. Um, and we use both in varying scenarios, depending on the case and depending on the length of time that you have to review documents. There's prioritized review, which continually ranks documents based on more of the yes response versus more of the no response. As reviewers are continuing to give that input into the active learning system, with the hope that eventually the model will stabilize at some point and you won't have to review the entire set of documents. The other uh, type of active learning is called, it's a categorization index. Is it called categorization? Now I'm blanking. I always
Coverage
refer to it
coverage
that way.
review.
Coverage review. Thank you. We create a categorization index. Thanks, sorry. Um, and that puts your documents into those two buckets of yes and no in a quicker way, um, eliminating those documents that are in the middle in like the 50 percentile range. So if you have a large amount of data, as you know, ESI continues to explode, and we're not just dealing with, emails anymore. Now there's lots of different types of data, Slack, Teams, um, you know, Facebook, social media, all kinds of things, right, that are involved in the data that we collect now and deal with. This is a really great tool to separate out what is relevant and what is not.
Awesome. So I know there was an interesting fact that you and I were talking about as we were talking about, you know, similar to the extracted text. You talked about the headers and footers, especially of the emails, and those pieces of information not necessarily being used as part of that process.
Right. So relativity, when you start an active learning process project on the back end, the project management team does a lot of evaluating of that set and setting up the project. And part of that is eliminating data that's not going to be useful to the system. And some of that is already built into Relativity's active learning. So when we isolate the data that is going to be going into the system and go into the index, Relativity automatically removes numbers, URLs, emails, headers and footers, any extracted text that is just extraneous, that's not going to have any value. So as you're reviewing, and Relativity's term for this index, the way that they, active learning utilizes this index is called the bag of words. So all of the extracted text that's going to be meaningful to your review is put into the index, and not in any particular order, not in any string of, phrasing or anything like that, not based on any sort of saved search. And as your review continues, it isolates the words that are coming up more in when you're selecting the yes answer or when you're selecting the no answer, and creating the model from there.
Gotcha. So I know here at Gulfstream we've started to streamline the active review model into kind of our new phases.
Mhm.
So before we get to the end of that, and we've kind of talked a little bit about that middle of the first and second phase, let's get into ways Gulfstream clients really use active learning. So you've talked
Sure.
about the two different types, prioritized review and coverage reviews. How do people really get started? As from a project manager's perspective, what do you do to work with your clients to set them up for success so that when they click that button and start reviewing documents, they've got the set that they really need?
So there's two different ways that we can approach this. Um, and it really depends on the type of case and the volume of the data. What's really great about active learning in particular is that even for smaller and mid-sized sets, this can be really useful. For those types of projects that maybe this is your first time with a large set of data, the largest set of data that you've experienced so far, this can be a really good way to get into more of a prioritized review, to eliminate maybe some over collection, um, and start to feed documents to, if you have a small review team that's in-house, that are more likely to be responsive to reduce, reviewer fatigue. And what's great about that is, as humans, we're really good at creativity. We're not meant to be doing these analytics tasks. Our value is greater than that as, attorneys, as paralegals, as ESI professionals. That's not what we're meant to be doing. And so handing that part over to the computer really gives us a way to evaluate, okay, is this something that I'm really need to be looking at, or is it not, in a very quick way? Some people will still have the mentality of like, well, I need to put eyes on everything. And that's fine. And you can still use active learning even if you are planning on identifying every single document manually. But this will kind of introduce more of those responsive documents on the front end so that when you get towards the end, like, okay, so none of this is really in line with what I'm looking for. On the other
Awesome.
hand, oh, sorry, I didn't
Oh
want
no, no,
to.
no, go for it.
That's okay. So another way that we utilize the system is in the investigative phase of a project, where, you have what we refer to as like the ECA database, in that workflow where we can apply a coverage review that will isolate documents that need to be promoted to review, right? This is really great for ex large cases that have an exceptional amount of data that there's just no way for people to or, no reasonable way, considering time and money and other factors that go into these cases, to be looking at every single document. And so that's another way that we use this tool.
Well, that's awesome. So that reminds me actually that recently we've been discussing what ways a couple of our clients have recently used active learning and learned about active learning as part of their live projects to see what the real benefits are. And that's led you and the team to construct a couple of new case studies, which I
Mhm.
know you're getting ready to release here in the next week or two. Can you tell our audience a little bit, a little bit about those case studies, the clients, what they were doing, and how what they learned from active learning?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have two examples that are on both ends of the spectrum. One was like more of a smaller, like mid-size set of data. One of our boutique law firm clients here in Texas. It was dealing with a sizable amount of data for them that they had been sort of familiar with the eDiscovery process, but not to the extent that they were using relativity. Their collection was on a much smaller scale. So this was really their first kind of foray into the eDiscovery world. And their, intention going in was to review every single document. And they had over 20,000 documents initially to review, and a team of 3 reviewers. Their turnaround time was 1 month. They had planned to review in 1 month. And because of those factors, those limiting factors, to try and reduce costs for our client, we recommended active learning. They weren't entirely comfortable, with that, considering that the whole thing was new for them. But they allowed us to run active learning in the background while they were doing their linear review, and our model stabilized at 44% of documents reviewed. Had they used active learning, they probably could have saved about 50% of actual review time, and with less than half the documents reviewed. The rest of the documents we fed to them in batches, using our active learning model that we had set up, uh, from the higher ranked documents to lower ranked documents to kind of give them that experience of seeing the more, prioritized documents versus the ones that active learning deprioritized as the no response. And because of that success and showing them the model and how it stabilized, the next project, they were again open to active learning and actually were, able to use it effectively, with their short turnaround timelines, and new confidence in the system.
That's awesome. Was it? I mean, just out of curiosity, uh, somebody else was telling me, was this our client that also had the traditional way of looking at every document multiple times from the
Yes.
perspective of trying to find documents for each request. So they might have to look at the same document 3 or 4 times, depending upon how many times it comes up in a search.
That's correct. Yes.
So it's
So
oh, go ahead, go ahead.
yes. So another factor to this is active learning is not our only tool, and it's something that we use congruently with other tools that we have by setting up saved searches to eliminate some, documents, by, using saved searches to isolate different custodians that they may be looking at with different claims. So this is something that's really used in conjunction with a lot of different tools that most are already familiar with.
So that's awesome. I mean, the time savings alone for them, I mean, as you mentioned, sounds like they could have been done 2 weeks earlier. They could have only passed off a bill to their client of half the time.
Hmm.
And the fact that they used it on their next project, it sounds like a win-win-win all the way around with active learning.
Absolutely, it was.
Well,
It was a great
perfect.
success.
So I know you've got another example for our team from a larger client with a larger data set as well.
Yes. So this is a longtime client of Gulfstream. They're a large international firm, and have several projects going with us right now. And they actually just contacted us for another one that they want to use active learning on. So they're starting to kind of get into the workflow of active learning and see its benefit in these larger cases. So this one, they had an outside review team, and we worked with them on designing a plan for how we would use active learning with their outside review team. Um, and what they really loved most about this tool is the way that it feeds documents to reviewers without having to batch out documents and without having to go into like secondary batches and secondary reviews. You review the document one time and it's given a value, and then that updates the model and continues to feed the reviewers the documents that they need to see. And especially with an outside review team where you don't necessarily have the kind of the same oversight, it's just like a memo, like here, this is what we're looking for. It gave some more of that confidence that there's not going to be changes and different reviewers going back and looking at the same document, and really organized and streamlined their review.
Interesting. So did you on that project or did our client find I know how you run an active learning is different than the traditional setting up a batch, checking in and out.
Mhm.
Did the team find it any easier, harder to transition to the new workflow where all they've got to do is click a button to say, "Give me documents"?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was a really easy transition and wowed them a lot that it was that simple, and they didn't have to be, reviewing batches that had been checked back in to, for consistency and things like that, and really saved a lot of time. And a lot of that time is not billable, you know when you're re-reviewing and re-reviewing and re-reviewing, it comes to a point where, how many times can you review something before you say enough? Especially with the way that ESI has exploded and continues to just exponentially grow. Especially with this client who has very large cases running simultaneously with outside review teams. So they were really impressed with the way that that was run and how seamless it was. And I think the reviewers really appreciated it as well.
That's perfect. So I know we're getting close to the end of our time today, and while I open up the floor and welcome any questions from our audience today, and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat, and Taylor and I will be glad to answer them. I also do want to kind of go back to something that I alluded to earlier in our discussion, which is our five phases, talking about our five phases of active learning: preparing, setting it up for the review, the actual review, validating the review, and completing the review. So I want to ask you kind of my surprise question for you, which is of our five phases, what do you think, which phase do you think is most important for a client to spend the most time in and follow our workflow to be the most successful? And
Mhm.
why do you think that?
Okay. So the most of the phases are taken care of by our team and by the tool. So the project validation, that is integrated into the active learning model where it automatically comes up with those values.
Okay.
and we can assess at any point what the status is of the project validation. And there's many times when, a um, team will say, okay, we want to check the status now and see if we can stop reviewing. Where's the model at? Have we stabilized? And we can run that multiple times until we get it to a point where the illusion rate is where we need it to be. And everything looks right, and we can say, okay, we're going to call it, and nothing else is responsive. um, so that's really powerful to not have to do that manually. I feel like that's a really important part of the whole process, is to trust that data and rely on that data. One thing that I think is really important just to share with reviewers, if you are the one reviewing these documents, everybody has to be on the same page. That is the one thing with this system. When you have multiple reviewers, everybody has to be consistent in the way that they're reviewing, because otherwise the model just will not build correctly. So getting on the same page, having the same strategy, that is your job. The rest is the tool, and that's the project management team that's going to be there behind the scenes, monitoring the model, monitoring the index, and taking care of the project. So,
Well, that's awesome, and I love the fact that this is something that we can run side by side for somebody that's not yet comfortable with the technology, doesn't hinder them, doesn't impede them from running a traditional linear review if that's what they want to run, but we can continue to streamline even that process, even if it's just eliminating the batch concept, so
mhm,
that they can get, and it sounds like this would also be a process to take them quicker to an initial production, where if they use that prioritized review, they could get through what our chances are the most likely relevant documents quicker and be left with just that non-relevant set for the most part at the completion of, or at a pretty quick pace as part of that process.
absolutely. And there's actually, you can run multiple active learning projects in a workspace.
Okay.
You don't have to do this just one time. If you're looking at one specific claim or one specific thing that you're evaluating documents for, you can run the active learning project, and it doesn't completely eliminate that document from the workspace. You can still create another active learning project with another field and evaluate all of those same documents for something entirely different. So if you have a rolling production situation, each time you need to create a new production, we can run a separate active learning project that pools all of those documents back in to be reevaluated for a different claim.
Well, that is awesome. Well, Taylor, thank you so much for joining me today. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to email us at any time. Also, I will tell you those case studies in more detail, including a white paper that we're getting ready to release, are coming out in the next week. If you would like a copy of that, please let us know, and we will be glad to make sure you get a copy. I will also invite you to join me on Wednesday, May 24th. I have a special guest joining me that's going to be talking about the science behind search term validation. And it's a very good friend of mine, a litigation manager at one of our existing clients. Taylor, thank you so much for joining me today. As always, it was a pleasure. I know I found it useful, and I hope everybody that attended did as well. And hopefully, the sun is shining in your part of Texas today.
It is. It definitely. I'm gonna go jump in the Guadalupe for a minute here.
Well, I am utterly jealous until I get this pool actually in my backyard. Everyone, thank you again for joining us today for Gulfstream Legal's Poolside Chat. Taylor, thank you again, and we will talk soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye bye.